When inflation picked up a couple of years ago, no one was happy. Well, nearly no one. There was actually one country where the prospect of a supply-side inflationary shock was almost welcomed, and that was Japan. That's because Japan has been in a deflationary funk for the best part of 3 decades now, and at least some investors and policymakers hope that this might finally be enough to reawaken what used to be the richest economy in the world. So in this video, we're going to look at how inflation has affected Japan's economy, and whether this might be the beginning of Japan's long-awaited post-crash recovery. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start with a bit of context. In the post-war years, Japan experienced decades of rapid economic growth, with the Japanese economy growing by an average of 7% every year from 1955 to 1990. However, after a rapid appreciation in Japanese stock and real estate prices during the 80s, in the 90s, a series of economic bubbles burst in quick succession. In the decade after 1990, residential house prices fell by more than 50%. Commercial property prices fell by something like 85%, and Japan's main stock index, the Nikkei 225, fell by about 75%. Japan's economy never really recovered from this, and growth and inflation both remained close to zero for the next few decades. This is because Japan experienced a so-called balance sheet recession. Essentially, Japanese households and companies had taken out too much debt when asset prices were rising. So when asset prices fell, Japanese individuals focused on paying down their debts, i.e. repairing their balance sheets. While this might make sense on an individual level, if everyone in the economy starts doing it at the same time, then everyone stops spending and the economy stagnates. This also explains why even ultra-loose monetary policy didn't restart Japanese growth. In fact, the Bank of Japan cut interest rates to below zero and bought up an unprecedented amount of Japanese bonds, corporate debt, and even stock. But not much happened. Presumably because Japanese households and companies were so focused on debt minimization instead of profit maximization. So they didn't want to borrow more money regardless of how low the interest rate was. Because Japanese households were focused on paying down debt, they also stopped spending money, pushing Japan into a deflationary state. This probably put further downward pressure on Japan's growth rate, because when consumers expect lower or flat prices, as they do in a deflationary environment, they have little incentive to spend, or at least less incentive to spend than they would if prices were rising in an inflationary environment. This means less consumption, and therefore a lower GDP. In fact, a cultural taboo against price rises even developed. Japanese consumers began to expect constant prices, so Japanese companies would try as hard as possible to insulate consumers from changes in production costs. To give a sense of quite how prevalent this taboo was, in 2016, when a major ice cream company hiked the price of its most popular popsicle from 60 to 70 yen, its first price rise in 25 years, and the equivalent of less than a 10 pence price rise, they released an advert apologizing to consumers. You get the idea then. Japan was stuck in a deflationary spiral, with consumers refusing to pay higher prices or even just spend more money. This is why there was some hope that the inflation we've seen over the last years would actually be good for Japan's economy. The global increase in energy and commodity costs was too big not to be passed on to consumers, and in April 2022, Japan's annual inflation rate, which had averaged at just 0.35% since 1990, rose above 2% for the first time in nearly a decade. The hope here was that this relatively high inflation would trigger a mild wage price spiral. In other words, that workers will be able to point to higher inflation to negotiate higher wages, which would in turn mean more spending, so higher inflation and higher wages, etc., etc. This self-reinforcing loop or spiral could then keep Japan out of deflation indefinitely, or at least until its next financial crisis, and kill off the taboo against price rises. Ironically, wage price spirals are the exact same thing that Western central banks are trying to avoid, because they worry that a wage price spiral will push inflation up too high. This is one of the reasons that Japan's central bank has been so reluctant to raise rates, while other central banks have been doing just that. And there are tentative signs that this process has actually begun in Japan. While wages lag behind inflation in 2022 and 2023, this year the average wage growth is due to come in at above 5%, well above the current inflation rate, and the highest since 1991. Similarly, inflation has proved relatively sticky. Year-on-year inflation has stayed above 2% for 25 consecutive months, and the taboo against price hikes has apparently dissolved. The Bank of Japan's latest Tankan survey, for instance, shows that Japanese firms now expect inflation of 2% or higher for the next 5 years. Japan has also emerged as a potential beneficiary of deglobalization, with high-tech firms in Southeast Asia setting up shop to protect their own supply chains. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, for instance, is spending $20 billion building 2 plants in Japan, the first of which is due to open at some time this year. And a weak yen has also triggered a tourism boom, with a record 18 million people visiting the country in the first half of 2024. All of this has got investors very excited. Last month, Morgan Stanley claimed that Japan's economy has been revitalized, and Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway has recently started buying up Japanese stocks, which have finally recovered from their 1990 peak. However, scratch beneath the surface, and everything doesn't look quite so rosy. For starters, growth does remain stagnant. Despite a tourism boom, an increase in foreign investment, and an increase in wages, in the first quarter of the year, Japan's GDP contracted by 0.5% year-on-year, having flatlined in Q4 of last year and declined by 0.9% in Q3. At the same time, thanks to the divergence of monetary policy between Japan and other developed countries, the yen has plummeted over the past few months, forcing the Bank of Japan to spend billions of reserves defending the currency on international markets. This speaks to a more general issue for Japan too. Because of the Bank of Japan's funky monetary policy, Japan has one of the highest debt burdens in the world, both because Japanese governments and Japanese companies hold an absurd amount of debt. Japan now has the highest public debt to GDP ratio anywhere in the world, coming in at 263% in Q1, as well as one of the highest private debt to GDP ratios, coming in at about 250%. This means that changes in interest rates have, in some sense, more of an impact on the wider economy than they do in other countries, which will make the Bank of Japan's job infinitely more difficult if inflation persists and it comes under pressure to hike rates.
If you want to learn more, then check out our physical magazine, Too Long. We've been working on this for a while now, but it's about to be printed and shipped. So here's everything you need to know. Too Long is 60 pages of our very best journalism, diving deeper into issues than we can on YouTube. As you can see from the front cover, this issue is focused on the UK general election, explaining what Labour want to do with their new huge majority, what each of the other parties are going to do next, and much more. It's more than just the UK though, with major stories from across Europe and the world, including the US election, the countries who could join the EU, the war in Gaza, and the European elections. We're really proud of how this product has turned out, and we think it's some of our best writing yet, able to dive into topics in a way that the algorithm just wouldn't allow. It's also a great way to support the channel, with the cost of production only increasing as we expand and advertising markets getting less stable. Your support helps us improve the business, improve our journalism, and helps us make more free YouTube content for everyone. If you're interested, you can go to toolong.news to buy a copy. There you'll find both standard and premium editions of the magazine, with the premium edition getting your name printed in the thank you section and getting you access to our behind the scenes podcast, The Bullpen. Premium editions will only be available until Thursday at 11 AM, when the print run begins, so you don't have long. You can also subscribe to Too Long, which gets you 25% off the price and a copy sent straight to you every 4 months. Subscribing really helps us turn this into a reliable revenue stream, which is super helpful when it comes to growing our business. Plus, if physical isn't your thing, then there's also digital versions. Anyway, sales close soon, so head to toolong.news to order now, and make sure to use code FINALORDERS to get an extra £2 off your purchase. Thanks for watching and for supporting TLDR.